everyone. Why don't we slowly start to make a start here? Good evening, and very warm welcome to Green College. My name is Nico, and one of the co-chairs of the Residence Member Series alongside Aaron. Such a pleasure to welcome you here tonight on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. For those who are new to the Resident Member Series, it's an opportunity for resident members to give talks here at the Coach House every Monday from 8 to 9. Green College is an interdisciplinary graduate college. We have folks ranging from master's, PhD, and professional degrees here, and we're absolutely delighted to have Evan Hall present tonight, coming to us from Public Health. For those who are new to Green College, we're just super happy, and for those joining us online as well, warm welcome to you all. Without further ado, why don't we start the night on an exciting title, Dining with Decorum, a Sensual Fireside Chat with AI on sex. Evan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nico. I want to start off with a quick positionality statement. My name is Evan Hall. I use they, them pronouns. I reside on the stolen and occupied territory of the Musqueam, where I attend graduate school. I grew up on the lands of the Anishinaabe, Wyandot, Suk, and Mississauga, in the place referred to by the Algonquin word Mishigamwa, meaning big lake or great water. I'm a white, uninvited guest to these lands with known Dutch and Hungarian Jewish ancestry and unknown European descent. My family legacy has immensely benefited from colonialism, the genocide of indigenous peoples, and enslaved labor, to which I have a great responsibility to act on and reconcile in my work. I am a queer, non-binary person living with multiple disabilities who is highly educated. I am a person vulnerable to HIV, but I'm not living with HIV. This positionality statement allows me to connect better with the people in this room today, so you know where I'm coming from, the knowledge I have, and the lands in which I have lived on my entire life. A little more fun about me here. These are just some fun pictures over the past year. My grandma, my siblings, lots of travel, and the ocean that's right beside us. So without further ado, I want to acknowledge that there is going to be a lot of problems talking about AI, but the first one I want to acknowledge is that AI has been and continues to be used in efforts of war and genocide, including against Gaza and Palestinians. Additionally, there is bias within algorithms and big data systems that uphold patriarchal and racist systems. There's additionally the plagiarism of knowledge and art, especially of BIPOC individuals and groups. And then finally, AI platforms are environmentally taxing and degradative, and they have a lot of resource extraction related to them. So that frames the contexts in which there are problems with AI, and despite me engaging in conversations with you about AI, these problems persist, even though it's a tool that many people have discussed as one of many benefits, but I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of drawbacks that are inherent to these systems. Another important caution that I want to have is that this is going to be an analysis and critique of the platform versus the models that are based off of generative AI. So there's a lot of language learning models, language learning processes. I'm not critiquing the models. I'm not that intelligent. What I can do is be a layperson and a researcher and engage critically with a platform for my positionality. I want to also mention that I have provided HIV STI services in the past when I was certified in Michigan. I'm not certified in Canada, but I do volunteer at local sexual health clinics. And so a lot of the stories, information, and knowledge that I have is not only from my lived experience, but also from my professional experience, not only as a researcher, but also as an advocate. So that's going to inform the analysis and critique of the platform, and not necessarily discuss what the algorithm might get wrong on a larger scale and kind of the challenges behind that. So if you're wondering how I went about doing this research, yes, I did ask everything that was on my mind related to sexual health and well-being. And one of the prompts I started out with, now there are going to be many prompts that I'm not going to talk about. Wait till the end and you're going to see some of the fun ones that won't be discussed in this talk. But I wanted to ask some of the more controversial sexual health questions that if you just Google the answers aren't going to give you the best answers. And so I wanted to see how the generative AI platform of ChatGPT would respond. So the first prompt, as you can see, will I get HIV from sucking dick? Well, what was the answer? It was a lengthy answer that talked about HIV transmission risk, partners' HIV status, other STIs, use of protection. So a lot of information to digest, nothing that would be too out of the ordinary from a quick Google search. But importantly, ChatGPT did something interesting around this perception of risk. And this will come out through many of the prompts and case scenarios that we discuss. But there is a difference, and this is oftentimes cited in the HIV criminalization literature, that there is a difference between probability and likelihood. So is there a probability of an individual contracting HIV from sucking a dick? Probably. That probability is quite low and minuscule. It has been documented 2 cases since the 1980s. And there are over 39 million people currently living with HIV today. So thinking about probability, there is, but the likelihood is quite small. So when we say generally lower than anal or vaginal intercourse, but it is not 0, it quantifies a probability that for a general individual Googling or asking ChatGPT, what's my likelihood from getting HIV from sucking dick? Here, it's quantifying it as something that is larger than it actually is. And it repeats itself while saying, while the risk is lower, it can still occur. So there's some challenging situations here because ChatGPT is trying not to give an absolute, but it's also not giving the space and specificity to just how different the type of risk is when we're considering the probability versus likelihood of sucking dick. So we're going to walk through 3 different scenarios. These are all scenarios that I did or I had when I was an HIV STI counselor back in the States. And we're going to walk through each one of them to understand what is the platform picking up on in terms of the information I'm providing. We're going to revisit it with a little bit more of an additional patient history, but I really want to understand what do we get out of providing these scenarios and then following up with questions. Because ultimately, and there has been some feasibility studies around this, these types of AI generative platforms can be used by medical providers. So let's talk about what we can learn from that. So I didn't just say, here's my case. I did ask some questions because these are questions that, as a healthcare provider, I would want to know. What sexually transmitted infection testing, including HIV, chlamydia, HPV, syphilis, and gonorrhea, would be suggested for testing in this case? How would I communicate the level of risk of contracting an STI from this scenario? And then how would I counsel the client in changing their sexual behaviors? So these are like the 3 pillars of HIV STI counseling that we center on in our work as public health practitioners. So the first case, this is real, but of course this is all de-identified. A young heterosexual mixed-race male, 18 to 24, comes in for STI testing. A couple weeks after going to the strip club, he explains that the stripper rubbed their tits in his face after he received a lap dance. So let's see what ChatGPT says. So for suggested STI testing, HIV, chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, and HPV, what we notice right off the bat is that there's a discussion of testing, frequency, and exposure likelihood. So regular testing connotates to some level of frequency around the type of test for the STI, and then after a potential exposure. Now, what is interesting from this is the action that was described in the case scenario. If you don't remember, the tits rubbed against the individual's face. And so the question is what is being defined as the potential exposure? And if that is being defined as a potential exposure, think about from the discussion of the probability versus likelihood scenario, does that warrant STI testing? And then there's also the relevance of exposure, so transmitted through close physical contact, skin-to-skin contact. But there isn't a greater deal of specificity to how close is close, skin-to-skin. Can you ask some more questions or provide information that would talk about the importance of the different exposures involved here? Because if you've ever engaged in those behaviors. Close can mean close on one night, close versus another, but there's just not enough information to say whether or not this exposure warrants these type of testings, especially given the case. Now, communicating a level of risk. I hate the word risk in sexual health versus public health versus medical language. People will always discuss risk. I use it in this context, and hopefully we'll discuss why it is stigmatizing, describing some of the wording that's used by ChatGPT and other public health entities. So now there's a distinguishing of the potential risk here versus the actual risk when it says a potential risk, especially if there was any oral contact or if any bodily fluids were exchanged. Now, if you were just someone reading this, you might be wondering, well, what does oral contact mean? Is that oral contact with certain reproductive organs? Is it through kissing? Is it through something else, right? So if that oral contact is through engaging with a tit or boob, does that really describe a potential risk versus something that's an actual risk in which we describe in public health? Now, what is interesting when we talk about the communication and level of risk is that ChatGPT says we should reassure and educate. I don't mind that. But there is a sense of personal responsibility that is discussed here, saying providing reassurance that getting tested is a responsible choice and is important for overall sexual health. Now, the reason I flag this, it's because it will come up again. But this idea of personal responsibility over one's sexual health is important. But for a platform to describe that as a responsible choice, what does that mean in the larger scenario of the different structural determinants of health or social determinants of health that are at play that makes an individual go get tested in the first place? So now we talk about in HIV/STI counseling, what can we do to change behavior or allow an individual to seek their pleasure in ways that might make the scenarios more healthy? So the first word that's jumped out to me as a public health practitioner was protection. There's a lot of discourse around using language like risk and protection because it assumes that individuals who are having sex are promiscuous and they aren't doing the right thing. And so they have to protect themselves from other individuals, and they have to put up like a shield between the contact because what they're doing is almost in a way like having a violent language towards it, and it's presenting itself in a stigmatizing context because if you say use protection and you're engaging sex to have pleasure, are you really pleasuring yourself? So the connotations of this is really important because if we start to put this language out here and recreate it from the internet, it becomes stigmatized in the relationships that we have in sexual relationships. So encouraging the use of condoms during any sexual activity is an interesting remark, especially when we know what was provided in the case scenario when it was a lap dance. And then when we move into the limiting the number of partners, it's lacking a nuance to what type of partner. Is it a sexual partner, romantic partner, casual partner, consistent partner, monogamous partner? It's not telling us. It's simply saying limit the number of partners. And so when we don't have that interface with an individual, we can't understand what type of partners they might be seeing outside of this incident. Now, it does recommend to say ideally have testing at least once a year or after any new partner or change in sexual activity. Now, it doesn't really center so much on the type of behavior they're engaging in. It's just providing a very generalized recommendation, which on the surface might seem legitimate, but there's an important things around centering what type of behavior an individual is engaging in to recommend a level of frequency for people around testing for sexually transmitted infections. Now, let's go to scenario number 2 before we revisit some of these cases. So, a young black female, 18 to 24, who identifies as non-binary and is bisexual, comes in for STI testing. They use they, them pronouns. They delayed testing for STIs because a medical facility shamed them for their sexual behaviors. They had sexual partners after this period and are worried about possible exposures. They do not know the status of their partner. Now, from what we had talked about previously, there's a little bit of information that's lacking here in terms of what type of behaviors they were engaging with, but we're going to go with seeing what ChatGPT says about this. Same questions as before. So first thing that popped out was there was a conditional statement. Given their bisexual identity and the uncertainty of their partner's STI statuses, the following should be recommended. Now, it's really interesting that they would have a conditional response based off of sexuality, because that's not something that pops into my mind first off the bat when I'm providing HIV and STI testing. It's something that contextualizes the scenario, but it doesn't give me the root basis for providing testing. And that is consistent across the board for HIV and STI best practices. Because if I just say, hey, you're gay, get these tests, that's not an accurate way of describing what type of sexual behaviors you're engaging in. It's merely a label of sexual identity. Now, what hasn't been discussed is these additional 2 tests. Remember, if you remember from the question that I asked, I prompted saying what type of tests they might include: HIV, chlamydia, HPV, syphilis, and gonorrhea. And trichomoniasin and HPV popped up. So obviously, the generative platform is trying to expand its horizons and associate, based off of the context that I'm giving it, some more STIs that could be possible. This is where it gets interesting. While there is no standard test for HPV in men or non-binary individuals, discussing the HPV vaccine is important, especially since non-binary individuals may have varying anatomies that can be susceptible to HPV-related health issues. On the surface, that sounds great, centering certain gender identities and having this discussion around varying anatomies. But what it doesn't do very well is it provides something of like a factual statement. There is no standard test for HPV in men or non-binary individuals. That it contradicts itself, because varying anatomies of non-binary individuals can present possibilities for those individuals who are assigned female at birth to receive HPV testing. But of course, ChatGPT doesn't know that. So it means it's not anatomically assessed, and so essentially it's reading into the situation around their gender identity and not providing enough information or enough nuanced information about having no test but a means of detection for not only men or non-binary individuals. So going back to the same generative prompt that's provided, we see another concept of responsibility about being responsible and proactive step for their health. And we will note that for later. Now, again, we see this idea of protection coming out with connotations to certain sexual barriers. Important to note, condoms or dental dams, it does take an account for the different types of anatomies that might be involved. And it does posit certain sexual barriers, tools such as condoms and dental dams, as some of the more formative and important ones. Now, again, we see this idea of limiting partners. But this is the interesting part here, that it says engaging in monogamous or less fluid arrangements can help mitigate risk. Where did it get that from? Because interestingly enough, there's nothing that we've discussed around sexual partners other than the client didn't know their statuses of their partners. And so talking about monogamy or less fluid arrangements as if I were to receive this as a healthcare provider, it doesn't give me enough information on, okay, well, I don't know what type of partners they're having, and then is this the kind of information that's useful for an individual around promoting better sexual health? And similarly to the first scenario, there is stuff around vaccinations, regular STI testing that is consistent. Now, let's jump to scenario number 3. This is a common one that I had. A young white gay male, 18 to 24, comes in for STI testing. He went clubbing over the weekend and had casual sex with some strangers, but he was too intoxicated to remember whether or not condoms were used. He's heard about HIV PrEP, but has not started. He has anxiety about how many STIs he might have gotten. He remembers giving someone a blowjob in the bathroom. He identifies as a bottom, but on rare occasion tops when under the influence. So, same questions. Now, again, this idea of protection comes up in the scenario, and again, it lists all these things. I will note here, again, there's no standard test, but you can screen and detect for HPV. All of these language and terms are not as nuanced when we see these responses. Now, again, this level of risk comes up around a night of potential high-risk behaviors. Now, the reason why I've been honing in and hitting this over the head is that if I were to, every time a client came in, describe their behaviors as risky, I would be characterizing their actions that they might engage with on a daily basis or every once in a while as something that should be feared, something that shouldn't be almost not normalized but normative. And it creates a sense of distance between me as a healthcare public health practitioner with their ability to seek out healthy behaviors like going to get tested. So by ChatGPT, if I was just somebody asking and I didn't have the knowledge that I do as a public health practitioner and as someone of lived experience, characterizing my behaviors as high risk would deter me in many ways to get tested because, like we'll see in a moment, there are some suggestions around how you do deal with stigma in the healthcare setting, but ultimately you might be misgendered if you go into a healthcare setting, or you might be accused of having high-risk behaviors and shamed for that, as we saw with scenario 2. And so when the generative AI platform describes these behaviors as high risk and emphasizes that it was in their ball and playing field to essentially mitigate that risk, it doesn't recognize that there are larger systems at play, and also it's lacking a couple of details that we'll talk about in the moment. When it discusses specific risks, like giving oral sex, giving a blowjobs, carries a lower risk for HIV. Now notice here, it didn't mention any other STIs, which actually have a higher rate of transmission through oral sex. It just jumps to the conclusion of HIV, which is still talking about this possibility versus likelihood with HIV transmission through oral sex. I don't know why it fixated on that, but again, this is in one chat stream, so maybe it was just picking up on it a lot. And once again, we see this concept of responsibility. Reassure the client that testing is a responsible and important step, regardless of whether they remember using protection. That language of protection, again, comes up. So risk, responsibility, and protection. Now, again, language of protection comes up, consistent in all of the scenarios. Now, they talk about HIV PrEP, which is very important, but it says discussing the benefits of HIV PrEP for those at higher risk, like having casual and sometimes unprotected sex. This kind of language doesn't characterize what we need as healthcare practitioners as the information around should an individual get on PrEP. When someone says casual sex, well, casual can mean many different things. I've had clients say casual is once every 3 months. Well, casual for other people, they don't see it like having sex twice a day. That's not casual for them. They might define that differently. So there is a lack of specificity that for a healthcare practitioner, it wouldn't provide them enough information to say, oh yes, this individual would be eligible for PrEP. And then also unprotected sex. That is a very interesting term. We often describe that benefits around PrEP are for condomless sex because it describes the type of sexual barrier that either was or was not used. Unprotected sex can mean a lot of different things because of the personal connotations that the idea of protection has. So if people engaged in sex, but it was only oral sex, that might be different in terms of their levels of perception around, is this actually something that I can protect from? A lot of people don't realize that dental dams and condoms are part of this idea of protecting themselves, engaging in this type of sex. So there's a lot to unpack here, and it doesn't really give us a great direction on how to discuss and consult with our client around HIV PrEP. It also describes they should consult with a healthcare provider. This is interesting because it's so general and broad that it varies from state to state, county to county, province to province, country to country. And so it's very important that we don't necessarily create a hierarchical means to put healthcare providers at the top, like we think of doctors, but recognize that people like myself could refer individuals for PrEP without them having to see a doctor. And then we see this level of risk, again, associating it with limiting substance use. And so this is kind of some of the things that we would talk to. But again, using that language of risk can be quite damaging if we don't contextualize why the substance use is occurring. And then again, testing is a good practice, but it doesn't put everything together because it doesn't tie in the number of sexual partners, the considerations around HIV PrEP, using protection or sexual barrier methods. So now this is the part that I'm excited for because we're going to revisit each of the scenarios, but I am providing a little bit more of a patient history so that we can see what the generative platform says about these differences. And so remembering our first scenario, the patient history says there's been no previous STI testing and they've only had 2 previous sexual partners, only oral sex with a vaginal orifice, and they've had no history of drug use or penetrative sex. Now, this is a language that I would try to use when I'm taking notes because it tries to be very specific about the different organs, the different behaviors, and clear around the number of individuals or the number of acts or sexual behaviors involved, while also describing their past testing history. So what do we have again? This is interesting because it was the first time where I saw a response that was actually just flat out wrong in a way that couldn't necessarily be debated. So it says, while the risk is lower, there's still a possibility of exposure, talking about HIV, particularly if there was any intimate contact that could involve saliva. Now, it is very important to know HIV cannot be transmitted through a bodily fluid such as saliva. But this output, despite having the output that I generated earlier in the chat, this was still provided as a response. So again, relying on this as a purely accurate source of information shows right here that you can't. And it's kind of disturbing that it would even suggest this because there is no literature that describes this. There's literature that describes how it's not, and so it's interesting that this comes up. And this is a non-negotiated or debated topic in that. So I went through all the other ones that were produced, and I only look for the differences between the responses. And so again, we are going back to the counseling portion. So safe practices. So advise on being cautious, especially while intoxicated, to make clear decision making regarding safe practices. And then also stress the importance of discussing sexual health histories with future partners to minimize risk. Again, we see this language of safety, but they're trying to get a good message across around better sexual health practices, educating on communication, things that I would really appreciate in my services, but it's not as specific as I would like to see more behavioral modification tactics that would be communicating with individual. It's very broad in general. It can look different for everyone. Scenario 2, what patient history are we adding here? So the individual is previously vaccinated for HPV. The last STI test was a year ago with only 2 sexual partners up to the first attempt to test. Remember, this individual delayed testing because of the shame that they felt from a medical facility. They've had oral sex with a male partner, so I specified what kind of organ, so the penis, and playing with sex toys with a partner who has a vagina. And then 2 non-penetrative partners of different sexual organs with oral sex, and 1 penetrative partner in vaginal sex 2 weeks prior to this testing interaction. So let's revisit what the responses would be here. This is the first time, and I want to note, because I believe I sent out an email last month or in December about the importance of testing windows within sexual health testing. So it says here, including penetrative vaginal sex within 2 weeks prior to the testing. So this is the first time the platform has picked up on something that is very important around the specificity and the ability for lab testing to pick up STIs. Not all STIs can be picked up right away. And so I was trying to get this out of some of the responses because if I just went clubbing the weekend before I went testing, the likelihood of me picking up a lot of different types of STIs is very low. So it takes a while for the types of tests that people are getting to show any results regarding STIs. And that can vary from province to province, state to state, country to country, depending on what type of testing they're using. And if you existed through the COVID-19 pandemic, you can say this with ease, that there were different types of tests around antigen, antibody tests, and everyone was trying to understand what that means. Similar to this is that there's a period of window where the testing would be optimal. So there is an emphasis on vaccine history for once, but it's neglecting a nuanced history for HPV vaccine because it says HPV testing isn't typically offered for men or non-binary individuals, and it's discussing risk factors for hepatitis A and hepatitis B, but I didn't provide vaccination history there, and so that's something that's important to note is that they can discuss HPV, but HPV vaccination, but not discuss hepatitis A and B vaccination status in a concurrent way without having had provide that additional patient history. So it seems that if you provide words around vaccinations, it might pull up more information around different types of vaccinations that would be useful in this 18 to 24-year-old population. So again, we see this testing frequency providing some connection to the different types of sexual activity, again, when engaging with new partners or any changes in their sexual activity. Again, this is not nuanced language, and it kind of frustrates me because if you're engaging with new partners every day, that would imply that you should get tested every day, or any changes in their sexual activity. That can be very misleading, and so I would always underscore that if you do have changes in sexual activity, note when that's occurring and recognize that if it was over a weekend and you were intoxicated or at the club, that a test that you get on Monday, if you went out clubbing on Friday, isn't necessarily the ideal time to do it. But this regular STI testing response from ChatGPT might suggest that you should do it sooner. Now, thank goodness it addressed this because I wanted to do it in the first time, but it talks about addressing the healthcare experience where they felt shamed. So encouraging the patient to seek out affirmative supportive healthcare providers who respect their identity and experience. Great, I love that. But it, again, took us providing a patient history to get that out of the platform. Scenario 3. So patient history, so regularly sexually active with multiple sexual partners, inconsistent condom usage, previously tested 2 months prior, all tests came back negative, previously treated for gonorrhea 4 months prior, and received 1 dosage of the Mpox vaccine. Now, this is important because there were a lot of STIs that could be pulled from the information that I gave it, but it didn't, Mpox did not come up based off of just the initial prompt, which is concerning because as a public health practitioner, you're more aware about the certain epidemics or outbreaks that are happening in your area. And it might be important to note whether an individual has knowledge of that particular STI or not, because that could frame the conversations you're having. But it's interesting that until it was prompted, the platform would not talk about it. So again, this is suggesting a hierarchical nature of behaviors. So a potential night of exposure after a night of clubbing, testing is crucial. Now, importantly, what you can recall from the additional information is regularly sexually active with multiple partners. But the platform is still fixating on this idea that the night of clubbing is what could possibly have been the exposure, rather than engaging more in a nuanced fashion with multiply sexually active partners. We also don't necessarily know whether those partners are seeing other people, or are they monogamous, so a friends with benefits situation that they've talked. There's not that information there that we would be able to get face to face. Around the Mpox vaccination, it's interesting because additional vaccination may be warranted. It's very important to note that if you do receive the first dose of an Mpox vaccine, you should get the second because it's not completely protective in a single dose. But that information isn't pulled out here, and that's kind of the not absolute language that the platform tends to struggle with. And so an additional vaccine may be warranted. So if this individual was already hesitant around receiving the vaccine in the first place, if it's just something that could be warranted, who knows? And so there's some challenges here. And also, I will say, mpox testing is different from all of these other testing because it's still in the development phase. And so it doesn't talk about, it does talk about the specific mpox testing around symptoms. So right now, symptomology is important for mpox testing. So it's getting information right, but if you look at the whole statement, it can be a little construed on what information we want to have. This one is interesting. Encourage him to carry condoms for readiness. What a statement. I think I've discussed before that I always carry a condom on me, but I think it's interesting to say readiness because we did prompt it with multiply sexually active partners and we did talk about clubbing, but it's also interesting that inconsistent condom usage doesn't mean you don't have condoms on you. That's a concept that if you haven't explored, those kind of things can come into play when we think about power dynamics or power imbalances within sexual positioning. And so this is the challenge if we're describing this individual as a bottom, so somebody who is receiving often anal or oral sex. Is it the onus of them as the bottom to bring the condom and not the top? So it's weird that ChatGPT is kind of hitting at this social positioning and onus of responsibility to different sexual positioning. And so I'm curious what it would say about a top, but that's for a different time. Again, this language of risk around HIV PrEP is really important because just because you take a medication to prevent something like HIV and you engage in the same behaviors, there's a little behavioral discordance that occurs because you are taking a medication that significantly lowers your susceptibility to HIV, but you're still engaging those behaviors. And so characterizing that as high risk for an individual taking a pill once a day might not make sense because they might not be taking HIV PrEP to change their behavior, but to mitigate the impact of STIs on their sexual behaviors and sexual health. So let's talk about what we've learned. So what you put in is what you receive as an output, somewhat. So you notice throughout the different scenarios, based on the information we gave it, it pulled out certain key phrases and kind of regurgitated something around the lines of something that sounded sophisticated enough to say, yeah, I should do that. Get regular testing. Well, okay, yes, that's important, but what is the context around that regular testing? What's the context of those sexual behaviors? Because we put in the possible exposures, but the output around what we were getting was somewhat bland and lacked nuance. So information on gender, sexuality, and gender expression are not the same thing. And medicalization of them is complex. And so as somebody who does research and is a public health practitioner in these spaces, the way that we talk about an individual's sexual behaviors and the certain sexual organs that they were engaging with and the behaviors, it's important to recognize that labeling gender, sexuality, and gender expression as quote-unquote risk factors is inherently wrong because it again puts the onus and responsibility on the individual that because they have these genders or sexualities or gender expressions that is inherently the problem. And the medicalization of these terms, as we saw with that one example, given their bisexual identity, that doesn't tell us anything about what kind of medical testing that they should receive. So it's complex. And I don't think the platform was able to understand that nuance. Not surprising, but it could over time get better. However, so much information has to go into describing these different characteristics that the platform might construe them and go on a different tangent and actually do some bad things, which we can discuss in a little bit because I did ask it. I provided a scenario to the platform, and I did this for different situations around a trans-identifying individual engaging in a sexual behavior, and I asked it if a certain act was or could be considered transphobic, and it provided a very interesting response. So if you want to talk about that afterwards, I also did that with race and body type and saw what it put out there. Now, you won't probably die, but you could And this is talking about this idea of possibility over likelihood. You've probably done it where you have a cough and you WebMD it and you think you have, some rare cancer. Not to say that that's not a bad thing, but when you ask these generative AI platforms, like we did here around, can I get HIV from sucking dick, the information isn't definitive enough to tell you, should I be worried about this? And that's really important because individuals and health-seeking behaviors for sexual health testing can be really challenging. People were scared about giving COVID-19 tests back in the day. Think about the very intimate and often invasive engagements around STI testing with swabs and describing your whole sexual history. Creating that sense of fear doesn't help an individual promote healthy-seeking behaviors, and it often creates a higher barrier for an individual to seek out those behaviors because they're worried about the results. When in fact, this idea of, you could, in any scenario, have X, Y, and Z STI, it doesn't provide that nuanced level of susceptibility. Am I the problem? AI says yes. And I think we've seen that time over time again with this idea of protection, this idea of responsibility. I don't mind saying that an individual should take agency over their sexual health, but should we think about that in a way that centers their behaviors as a reason to be problematic in terms of STI testing, saying that because I've engaged in X, Y, and Z behavior, I must be destined to get gonorrhea, when in fact that's, STIs really don't care who you are. And again, I'll emphasize with the COVID-19 pandemic, they really didn't care who you are. It just, as a virus, went. And we're talking about viruses and bacterial infections, and they don't guide themselves in a way that recognizes the individual. Those do operate in larger structural systems that, if you want to talk about that later, that can complicate it and does direct towards certain groups. But generally, the AI platform didn't provide a broader scope of recognizing that the behaviors themselves weren't problematic, that the overall responsibility to get testing, promoting a better sexual health, can be part of a larger idea around sexual health being part of a holistic health approach, which I think is very, very important. So AI will give you what Google can't without references. So as you saw in each one of those responses, it was nice, neat, laid out bullet points, 1, 2, 3. Google won't necessarily do that, but it does give this sense of legitimacy that I often worry about, because a lot of people who come into who came into even the clinic that I volunteer at now, they'll be like, well, Google or someone said this, and it's like, okay, great, we can at least go back and see what sources you're citing. But here, if I could ask AI what sources, but we've seen, and there's been so many documented cases of this, AI might generate who knows what random source that isn't real. So there's a sense that it might legitimize itself as a platform. And then this is what I'm going to lean into, because in fact, if you did the same prompts on someone else's laptop or even on my laptop today, the responses might be different. And so policies on sex and sexual health for AI can be circumnavigated, and we'll talk about this in a moment. But if you know the way around them, you can get to certain prompts that work for what you want it. So you can self-validate or spiral. And there is a New York Times article about a woman who has a ChatGPT boyfriend, and that every 28,000 words, which is the limit for ChatGPT and their normal platform, it resets. It's a fascinating article, but they're able to circumnavigate a lot of the things that you think wouldn't be able to be answered on ChatGPT, but actually can be. And so this idea of knowing the way to get to the answer you want is highly problematic when we're talking about sexual health testing, because we don't want individuals to just get to the answer that they want. We want to have those conversations about what type of behaviors they're having, and the sexual susceptibility of their overall sexual health practices. So My biggest takeaway is do not use AI as a substitute for your sexual health, because it just will get confusing, of course, because for somebody who is an individual like myself, who's been researching for a long time and who does this for a living and who talks about sex breakfast, lunch, and dinner, a lot of the answers here I can decode and understand. But for somebody who might just be a general healthcare provider, a fun fact, in the US and probably in Canada, a medical provider, there's 1 hour of medical training discussion on how to take a sexual history. So even if you're trusting just a general medical provider to read ChatGPT and their responses, or any generative AI platform that's used in the future to help address sexual health, you're gonna fall into this case of like, what is it saying? What is it actually doing? But I will say, for other sexual things, you can, of course, use it. And this is what I'm going to show you, because I asked a lot of things of ChatGPT, including these ones here. I'll let you read through some of them, but yes, each and every one of these produced a real response, and it was actually interesting, the level and depth that it provided. Sometimes I was confused because it did a better job of answering these scenarios than it did for sexual health testing, but I have a bunch more that I asked it, including some of the things around transphobia, racism, and fat phobia. And so if you're curious on what these said, please come afterwards, because YouTube will demonetize anything I'm about to say about these things. So with that, I thank you for your time.